Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 805 for February 9th, 2020. Coming up in a few minutes.
We use relatively very low levels of peat compared to things like the fertiliser and the compost industry. But what the industry has done absolutely to recognise that we are users of peat is to invest in the restoration of peat bogs across Scotland.
It's been a decade since the Scotch Whisky Association released a set of objectives to reduce the industry's environmental impact. While there has been a lot of progress, especially in developing the use of biomass and other alternative energy sources, there is still a lot of work left to be done. Later this year, the United Nations will hold its next Climate Change Summit in Glasgow, and the SWA is working on not only a progress report, but a new set of goals for the future. I'll talk with Scotch Whisky Association CEO Karen Betts later on WhiskyCast in Depth as part of our series of episodes this year, focusing on the impact of climate change on whiskey. That's just ahead, along with the calendar of events, the What I'm Tasting This Week department, and much more, all on this edition of WhiskyCast.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. The coronavirus outbreak that started in China and has spread to other countries is starting to have an impact on the whiskey world. The organizers of next month's Hong Kong Whiskey Festival announced this week that they'll be moving their event to May 16th because of the outbreak. Meanwhile, the promoters of Whiskey Live in Chengdu, China, are in wait-and-see mode for now. Their event is scheduled for April 17th through the 19th. We're also hearing from some brand ambassadors that their companies have ordered a ban on travel to events in China for now, and there's also concern that the outbreak will cut into travel retail sales at many airports in the Asia-Pacific region as consumers stay home to avoid the outbreak. Police in Scotland have arrested 2 men after a series of thefts at distilleries and whiskey shops at the end of January. The drinks business reports the suspects stole around 9,000 pounds worth of whiskies from the Cardew and Aberfeldy distillery shops, along with the whiskey shop in Dufton and the Whiskey Castle shop in Tomintoul. Both suspects denied any involvement in the thefts. Their next court hearing is set for April 28th in Elgin. Also on the crime and punishment front, former United Spirits magnate and White & Mackay owner Vijay Mallya will be back in a London courtroom this week. The Court of Appeal hearing is his last attempt to avoid being extradited back to India to face fraud and money laundering charges stemming from the 2012 collapse of Kingfisher Airlines. Indian prosecutors claim Mallya diverted Kingfisher assets into shell companies and even a Formula One racing team. His assets in India have been seized, and he also faces civil lawsuits for more than £1.1 billion in connection with the Kingfisher scandal. He also faces a lawsuit from Diageo seeking to claw back around $180 million in payments from Diageo's 2013 acquisition of his United Spirits shares and his work as executive chairman following the takeover. In other news, it's been a little more than 2 years since Macleod Distillers announced its acquisition of the Rosebank brand and plans to reopen the Rosebank Distillery in Falkirk, Scotland. Now, Macleod's first bottlings of Rosebank have been unveiled, with 2 single cask bottlings from 1993. That's the year Rosebank closed for good at the time. Gordon Dundas of Ian Macleod says there will only be 100 bottles of each available to the fortunate.
It's a very exciting time for us at Ian Macleod, along with obviously what's going on in terms of rebuilding the distillery as well. The whole Rosebank sort of juggernaut, I guess, is just beginning to slowly come back into town, as it were. So we're very excited by releasing these two casks, and we obviously think there'll be a huge demand for them. So that's why we're doing it via a ballot, which we think is the fairest way for us to launch such rare whiskey.
How will the ballot work?
Well, very simply, it's going to be firstly to the Rosebank subscribers, people who have joined the Rosebank sort of club, as it were. They'll get the first dibs on that, and then it'll be open for general release on Tuesday the 18th via rosebank.com/ballot. So that's how people will be able to get their hat in the ring, as it were.
How is the construction coming at the distillery?
Well, we broke ground in November, which was great. And literally when I was there in November, there was nothing left except the canal side buildings and the large chimney, which of course we are keeping. But we are progressing well with a hopeful sort of finish date of summer 2021. So we're looking at sort of 18 months. Obviously we've then got to, Robbie Hughes will be doing his thing with the spirit so that we get the spirit as good as we can get it, which we're very confident about because we've got, great stills. We've got worm tub condensers, which were key to making Rosebank the unique style of whiskey that it was. Quite floral, of course, but it always had that mid-weight, sort of slightly weighty sort of palate to it, I found, which just shows the contradiction of sort of triple distillation and then using those worm tubs, which generally give you that sort of more heavier style spirit. So I think that was one of the real unique aspects of Rosebank, which I think if you speak to most people, they'll say Rosebank was a very sort of house-style forward whiskey, if you know what I mean. You could always recognize a Rosebank because of, it was generally matured like these two single casks are in refilled bourbon hogsheads. So, that's very much the style that we'll be pursuing in terms of spirit and, of course, in terms of maturation.
The two bottlings will sell for £2,500 each. That's about $3,237 at current exchange rates. We also have a hint of what's coming next month. The first Rosebank bottling available to the public will be unveiled at next month's DFS Travel Retail Exhibition in Singapore. Other new whiskeys announced this week. Glenfiddich maltmaster Brian Kinsman went way back into the warehouses for the latest release in the Rare Collection series, with two single cask bottlings from 1975. Both were matured in European oak, but one is an ex-sherry butt, while the other was a hogshead cask. This is only the third Glenfiddich Rare Collection release since the 1990s, and it'll only be available in the U.S., with 100 bottles of each, at a recommended retail price of $9,000 each. Meanwhile, Glenmorangie will not be releasing a private edition bottling this year for the first time in many years. Instead, there's a new single estate bottling called the Cadboll Estate Edition. You may remember last year's Alta private edition series bottling that used wild yeast found on barley grown on the Cadboll Estate near the distillery. Well, this 15-year-old whiskey is made with the estate's barley and is matured in first fill ex-bourbon casks. It'll only be available in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, with a recommended retail price of $85 a bottle. And Wolfburn Distillery is out with its fourth small batch single malt release. Batch 155 is a bit different from the first three. Like the others, it started out in first fill ex-bourbon barrels, but this one spent its final 6 months in Fonseca Ruby Port hogsheads. Only 5,000 bottles will be available. There's no word on pricing. In Irish whiskey now, Beam Suntory's Kilbeggan is expanding into the single pot still segment of the Irish whiskey market. Kilbeggan single pot still is made from a mash of malted and unmalted barley, along with 2.5% oats. But unlike most Irish whiskeys, it is only double distilled. It's a limited edition for now, and carries a recommended retail price of around $45 a bottle. Jameson is out with its annual St. Patrick's Day limited edition bottle. This year's release features a label by Dublin artist Stephen Heffernan that includes special tags that can be accessed with a smartphone. That lets the user create a customized label that can be entered into a pair of online competitions depending on where you live. It'll be available in 21 different countries, including Japan, Canada, New Zealand, and Italy, and only in Ireland at the Jameson Distillery Bow Street shop in Dublin. It will not be coming to the U.S. In American whiskeys now, Heaven Hill has released the first 2020 batch of Elijah Craig Barrel Proof. It's bottled at 68.3% ABV and carries the batch number A120. I'll have my tasting notes for it soon at the WhiskyCast website. And Utah's High West is releasing its 2020 limited edition bottling of Bourye, which blends straight bourbon and rye whiskeys that are all at least 10 years old. It'll sell for around $80 a bottle. Now, you've probably never heard of David Gooder, but for 20 years he was the chief trademark lawyer for Brown-Forman and the enforcer of the intellectual property rights for Jack Daniel's and its other spirits brands. Now, Gooder is heading to Washington to join the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office as the federal government's commissioner for trademarks. Finally, last time around, we mentioned the Super Bowl bet between Sonoma Distilling Company founder Adam Spiegel in California and his counterparts at Kansas City's J. Rieger & Company distillery. Well, the Kansas City Chiefs won their first Super Bowl in 50 years, and the Rieger team won the bet. They'll be getting a case of Sonoma Distilling Company's whiskey, and Adam Spiegel will have to hang a Chiefs flag in his distillery for a month. Adam will be looking for pictures of that soon on Instagram. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. The news is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Larceny Bourbon's heritage goes back to the days when Treasury Agent John E. Fitzgerald was patrolling the rickhouses of Kentucky, not just for the feds, but also for himself. He was stealing a taste of some of his favorite barrels of wheated bourbon on the side, and today's award-winning Larceny Bourbon has that same soft, smooth character Fitzgerald craved. Look for 92 proof Larceny Bourbon at your local retailer, and be on the lookout for the new limited edition release of Larceny Barrel Proof. You can always find out more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. It's less than a month now until I head to Christchurch, New Zealand for Whiskey Galore's Dramfest 2020 on March 7th and 8th. But if you're going to be in the area anyway, and I know it's a bit of a haul for a lot of you, I'll be leading a special American whiskey tasting on Friday, March 6th, the night before Dramfest kicks off. We'll be at the Carlton Bar and Eatery on Papanui Road in Christchurch from 4 until 6 p.m. We have to finish up before the evening's rugby match starts on the bar's TVs. I've posted links for tickets on our social media feeds and at the WhiskyCast website, and I hope to meet some of you there. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. Just in case you have forgotten, here's a reminder that Valentine's Day is coming up this Friday. And if your special Valentine just happens to be a whiskey lover, there are some events that just might make them swoon. Woodford Reserve Distillery has its Feast of St. Valentine at the distillery in Versailles, Kentucky on the 14th. Buffalo Trace has its Buffalo Love Dinner that same night at the distillery in Frankfort, Kentucky. And the Brandy Library in New York City has a Japanese whiskey tasting for couples on Friday night, too. The Lakes Distillery in Setmerthy, England has Valentine's dinners on both Friday night and Saturday the 15th. Elsewhere, the Fraser History Museum in Louisville, Kentucky has a Michter's tasting on the 19th. Villa Conthor in Limburg, Germany hosts a Deanston single malt tasting on the 21st. Distill America is on the 22nd in Madison, Wisconsin. Julio's Liquors in Westboro, Massachusetts has its annual Go Whiskey Week of events that runs from February 25th through March 1st. The Whiskey Exchange will host a tour of Australian spirits tasting at its Covent Garden store in London on the 27th, with all proceeds going to Australian wildfire relief. And Whiskey Fête 2020 is in Montreal, Quebec on the 27th as well. Right now, we have 274 different events worldwide on our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. Just click on the search button to find out what's happening near you or wherever you'll be traveling soon.
From deep in the north, far beyond the wall, the howl of the frozen wind brings word of something new. A whiskey from the land of always winter, for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast In Depth is brought to you by Mortlock. All throughout this year, we're looking at the issues that climate change and the environment pose for whiskey makers around the world, and just how the industry is trying to face those challenges. Back in 2009, the Scotch Whisky Association released its first set of goals for reducing the industry's impact on the Scottish environment. This November, the United Nations will hold its next Global Climate Change Summit in Glasgow, and that's likely to put some added focus on the Scotch whisky industry. One might think that would have industry leaders nervous, but Scotch Whisky Association CEO Karen Betts told us it's actually an exciting time.
As the pressure in Scotland, in the UK, in Europe certainly mounts for economies to move towards net zero, and the Scottish Government has now legislated that Scotland will be net zero by 2045. I think some of the work that the industry is doing on that is really very exciting. COP26, the conference of the UN conference on climate change, will take place in Glasgow in November this year, and we are working very hard, in fact, on a review of our environmental policy, which last year was 10 years old, now to look at where we got in those first 10 years, where we need to get to between now and net zero in 2045, and what we would need to do to get there. And that is something that we will be talking about increasingly this year, and I hope also at COP26. I think the industry has been really forward-looking in the environmental work that we've done, both in practical terms and encouraging the Scottish Government and the UK Government to come up with a policy framework that incentivises companies to make sure that they are, doing everything that they can to get to net zero, whether that's changing sources of energy or what we do with energy that we can no longer use at the end of an industrial process, all those sorts of things. So that's an exciting, very positive thing that's going on this year.
Just brainstorming for a second, one of the things that maybe ought to be on the table for discussion is the carbon impact of shipping all those glass bottles around the world.
Well, that's very interesting. A lot of our glass, a significant percentage of it comes from the UK and, in fact, comes from Scotland. And our companies are very keen to be able to source their glass as locally as possible. Interestingly, there's a sort of slightly complicated discussion going on in Scotland about that at the moment, because the Scottish Government wants to introduce a deposit return scheme to get people to, consumers to recycle much more consistently, which of course is a good thing. The thing that worries the industry at the moment is whether they will get actually the same volume of glass to recycle to produce clear glass for whiskey bottles as they have under sort of pavement recycling schemes that exist at the moment. But yes, absolutely, our industry very much supports a circular economy, and we don't want to break that circle in Scotland by having to import glass, we would very much like to be able to source all of the glass that the industry uses in Scotland.
I'm thinking more of the carbon impact of shipping all the bottles out of Scotland. As you've noted before, most Scotch whisky is actually exported from Scotland, and the Scotch whisky regulations of 2009 require now that all single malts be bottled within Scotland and that only blends can be shipped in bulk. And I'm wondering if there's a carbon impact to that of bottling in Scotland and then, say, shipping cases of glass and full bottles all the way to Australia, for instance, or China.
I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, when there was a complex arrangement around the time that it was decided that single malts should be bottled in Scotland, and that was really about questions of authenticity. And it's actually linked into our geographical indication. Whether in the future we would want to change that for exactly the reasons that you suggest, I don't know. But I can absolutely see the environmental driver.
The other thing on the carbon impact is peat. I know that there has been some push within Scotland, within the UK, within Europe and the world to cut down on the burning of peat. I know that compared to many other uses, the amount of peat the Scotch whisky industry uses is minuscule compared to regular consumer use and other uses. But is that a concern?
It is a concern to the industry. And as you say, we use relatively very low levels of peat compared to things like the fertilizer and the compost industry. But what the industry has done absolutely to recognise that we are users of peat is to invest in the restoration of peat bogs across Scotland, and we are now putting more into that restoration than we take out. So I think that the industry absolutely has mitigated its impact in its peat use, and we would look to other peat using industries to do the same or to find alternative sources.
Karen Betts and her team in Edinburgh are working on a new peat action plan as part of their review of just how effective the 2009 environmental policy turned out to be. It'll be released later this year before the Climate Change Conference in Glasgow. And here's why the peat issue is especially important. Not only does burning peat in a kiln release the carbon that's been locked inside for many, many, many years, but harvesting the peat can leave the bogs drained of water, and dried peat also releases carbon into the wind. One example of the industry's restoration work, Diageo spent £600,000 last year to improve the water supply at the peat bogs it uses to feed the Port Ellen maltings on Islay. That money went to unblock clogged drainage ditches and build new dams, and they restored just over a square mile of peatland on the island. However, there is still much to be done. This past week, the owner of one of the largest peat suppliers on the Scottish mainland told the Herald newspaper that his bog at St. Fergus will be completely harvested within the next 10 years. Neil Godsman said the industry had better start looking for new sources of peat now while there is still time. That's because the Scottish government's current planning policies are biased against approving permits for new commercial peat extraction projects, and the government also has a goal of eventually phasing out the use of peat in gardening and horticultural use. That accounts for around 90% of the current demand for peat in Scotland. The whiskey industry's use of peat? Well, it accounts for less than 1%. That's WhiskyCast In Depth, brought to you by Mortlach, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlach lineup at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. It's been cold, rainy, and windy this week, and that makes it a peat week in my opinion. So let's start off with the 2019 revival of Ardbeg Supernova, the most heavily peated single malt in the Ardbeg range. It's bottled at 53.8% ABV, and the nose is just what you'd expect. Peaty and medicinal with touches of menthol and eucalyptus, along with roasted vanilla beans, toffee, and nice touches of charcoal ashes and fireplace soot. The taste is thick and fruity at first, followed by an intense burst of peaty phenolic character with a good ashiness, grilled fruits, and a subtle touch of toffee. The finish is long, oaky, and smoky, with subtle hints of clove, toffee, and orange peel. I'm scoring the Ardbeg Supernova 2019 edition a 94. Laphroaig is kicking off what it's billing as a 15-bottle series honoring Ian Hunter, who owned and ran the distillery between 1908 and 1944, and was the last member of the Johnston family that founded Laphroaig in 1815 to own the distillery. The Ian Hunter story is 30 years old, and it was matured in American white oak casks. It's bottled at 46.7% ABV, and the nose has a gentle smokiness with hints of butterscotch and manuka honey, along with baked apples, vanilla, and a hint of lemon peel. The taste is peaty, medicinal, and tart with lemon pepper, iodine, heather, grilled pineapple, honey, and a hint of herbs in the background. The finish is long with a good balance of peat smoke, citrusy tartness, and hints of iodine and briny wet beach sand. I'm scoring the Laphroaig Ian Hunter Story 30-year-old single malt a 95. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by our friends at Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. Rye whiskey was distilled by America's original risk-takers and history makers. Those first barrels of whiskey were bold, flavorful, and full of passion. Sagamore Spirit proudly picked up the torch with their spring-fed Maryland-style rye whiskey. It celebrates the grit and glory of those patriotic ancestors who sipped their way into American history. Visit SagamoreSpirit.com to explore their award-winning spirit. One more Isla whiskey now. The other night, the guys from the It's Just the Booze Dancing blog stopped by with their West Coast colleague, Aaron Krause, and he brought along a bottle of the Berry Brothers and Rudd 1997 Kalila 11-year-old single cask. Now, there are a couple of these casks around. This one was cask number 319464, bottled at 55% ABV. The nose has notes of peat smoke and heather, of course, along with grilled citrus and a hint of brine. The taste is smoky and peppery with a good balance between peatiness and white pepper with a hint of cinnamon. There's also lemon zest and a hint of brine in the background, too. The finish is long with gently fading spices, a good peatiness, and a slightly medicinal character. And I'm scoring the Berry Brothers and Rudd Kalila 1997 cask number 319464 a 93. And thanks to Aaron for bringing it along. Now, Sam Spears came along with the guys. You may have heard him on WhiskyCast tasting panel episodes in the past. And Sam brought along a whiskey I thought I'd probably never get the chance to taste. You see, back in 2011, William Grant & Sons produced a blended scotch with whiskeys from all of its distilleries to celebrate the 110th birthday of Janet Sheed Roberts, the last surviving granddaughter of William Grant. Only 1,600 bottles of the Hazelwood Janet Sheed Roberts 110th Birthday Edition were produced, and as the story goes, they were only given to William Grant & Sons employees. But a few have turned up on the secondary market over the years, and Sam Spears found this one at an auction. It's bottled at 55% ABV. The nose is aromatic and warm, with touches of baking spices, charred oak, a hint of wintergreen, and hints of honey and orange peel. The taste has an excellent balance of citrus fruits and baking spices, with hints of wintergreen, spearmint, and honey. The finish, it's extremely long, with spices that last and last, without overpowering touches of citrus fruits and a hint of mintiness underneath. Just an outstanding whiskey. I'm scoring the Hazelwood Janet Sheed Roberts 110th Birthday Edition a 95. and thanks to Sam Spears for giving me a chance to taste it. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of 2,800 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at whiskycast.com.
The search never ends, but it's nice when you can come in for a landing, pause and explore the silky smoothness of single pot still Irish whiskey, matured in the finest bourbon and Oloroso sherry casks. Land on Redbreast, then be sure to pass it on. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
Let's open up the inbox now for Your Voice, presented by Lot 40. Had a number of comments on last week's episode and our look at how the new U.S. single malt whiskey tariff is affecting whiskey producers and importers. Our longtime friend Raj Sabharwal of Glass Revolution Imports has been a critic of tariffs on both sides of the Atlantic and tweeted this the other day. Just wanted to add our perspective on tariffs. We have worked with Murray McDavid to split the tariffs, so for now we are holding prices. For Blackadder, we are focusing on blended malts. Hashtag keeping consumers happy. Thanks, Raj. William O'Hara at O'Hara Theorem on Twitter added this comment. Along with the obvious price issues, I would be interested to hear about the other effects the tariffs have on availability of whiskeys in general. For instance, I discovered that since mid-January, our local wine bar, which stocks only a limited number of spirits, replaced their single malt Scotch flight of Glendronach 12, Oban 14, and Lagavulin 16 with 3 different Compass Box blends. Well, William, that's a really good question, and let's open it up to the community. Have you seen any changes in the whiskey selection at your local pub since the tariffs hit? I'll admit that unless I'm on the road, I don't spend a lot of time in bars, so I may not be able to track changes in selection or prices over time, as well as some of you. So let us know what you're seeing out there. Now, every once in a while, we get a note asking why we spend so much time on the calendar of events segment during each week's podcast. Here, friends, is exactly the reason why. Luke Waddell sent this email this week from Colorado. Howdy, Mark. My wife and I were recently traveling during the Lunar New Year in Thailand. Prior to our trip, I was listening to an episode of WhiskyCast, and the calendar of events struck a note. The inaugural Whiskey Live Thailand was going on in Bangkok during our vacation. I quickly checked with my wife about the event, and we got tickets to participate while we were traveling. We arrived at the event sponsored by Pha Mai Holdings and checked in with ease. We were pleased with the space in one of Bangkok's downtown hotels and made our way around some of the exhibitor booths, enjoying a conversation with the Tamnavulin rep who was visiting from the Philippines, and adding it as an option for our growing bank of whiskeys we'll have and share with friends. We were also fortunate enough to be able to join the hosted Macallan tasting dinner later in the evening, which was a smash success. Pha Mai and the hotel staff paced the tasting and the courses excellently, and it was easy to socialize with our neighbors at the dinner and learn about other folks and their whiskey stories and passions. I'm excited to see Whiskey Live Thailand grow in its continuing years as Pha Mai Holdings, who put on a strong showing for their first year, refine their approach and look for further opportunities. My thanks to you and WhiskyCast for sharing the information in your calendar of events, enabling us to enhance our travels, learn about new whiskeys, and make new friends. Cheers, Luke. Luke, thank you for your email and that rundown of the weekend in Bangkok. Sounds like you both had a great time. Now, if you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always find us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at WhiskyCast, or you can just email us. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your Voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and all those other things that combine to make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. And this time around, I need to clarify something I mentioned in the news during our last episode. In reporting on Jameson's move to sell its Jameson Cold Brew coffee bean-infused spirit in the U.S. for the first time, I referred to it as a liqueur since it's bottled at 30% ABV. Of course, to legally be called a whiskey, the minimum is 40% ABV. However, as our friends at Irish Distillers pointed out after that episode, using the term liqueur is not correct, and here's why. While the term liqueur is used generically to describe distilled spirits that have added flavorings or wine and are bottled at below the 40% minimum strength for whiskey, the official definition in U.S. regulations also requires a liqueur to have added sugar or another sweetener in addition to any natural flavorings or extracts, and the sugar has to make up more than 2.5% by weight of the finished product. Now, the most well-known whiskey liqueur is Drambuie, but there are others as well. Now, Jameson Cold Brew has no added sugar, so it technically is not a liqueur. Officially, it falls into the federal government's catch-all category of distilled spirit specialty, which is how they classify spirits that don't easily fit into other categories. There's also a separate specific category for flavored whiskeys, those things like Fireball and the peanut butter flavored whiskeys we've mentioned on a couple of episodes, along with similarly flavored gins, rums, and vodkas. The official standards for those, natural flavorings with or without sugar, and bottled at no less than 30% ABV, and the name of the predominant flavor has to appear on the label. I've used the term natural flavorings a couple of times here. The U.S. regulations specifically require any distilled spirit that contains artificial or imitation flavorings to be labeled as a, for instance, imitation whiskey. In other words, you are supposed to use real vanilla beans or vanilla extract somewhere in the process to legally be able to call something a vanilla-flavored whiskey. You will probably never see a bottle of an imitation whiskey on a retailer's shelf, though, for obvious reasons. There is also a caveat, and I am quoting directly from the regulations. In determining whether a flavor is artificial or imitation, recognition will be given to what is considered to be, quote, good commercial practice in the flavor manufacturing industry. Read into that what you will. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, an 18th century style of premium Irish whiskey, blended from single pot still and single malt. Like yourself, it's one of life's treasured rarities, and what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copper Pot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find links for our WhiskyCast HD videos and the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast, the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and of course you'll also find a complete archive of all of our past episodes, all the way back to 2005. We love hearing from you. You can always get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch Whisky, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
WhiskeyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2020, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.